The chains bit into Ruby Wilson's wrists, the cold metal a stark contrast to the blazing Arizona heat that filtered through the barn's wooden slats. Her own brother had locked her up like an animal, and as the key turned in the padlock, she saw the man she once trusted transform into someone she no longer recognized. "Reckon this'll give you time to come to your senses," Jacob Wilson said, his voice eerily calm as he pocketed the key. "By morning, you'll be thanking me for saving you from that land-grabbing Harrington family." Ruby pulled against the chains, ignoring the pain. "You have no right. I'm 22 years old, Jacob. You can't decide who I speak to or where I go. As long as you live under my roof after Pa died, I'm the head of this household, and I won't have my sister consorting with the enemy." Jacob's face hardened as he backed toward the barn door. "That Matthew Harrington's been filling your head with nonsense. Their family wants our water rights, plain and simple." "That's not true and you know it," Ruby shouted, but Jacob was already closing the barn door behind him. Left alone in the growing darkness, Ruby slumped against the post where Jacob had secured her chains. The Wilson Ranch had been her home for her entire life, but since their father's death 6 months ago, Jacob had changed. The once protective older brother had become possessive, controlling, suspicious of everyone, especially the neighboring Harrington family. Ruby closed her eyes, remembering the afternoon she'd spent with Matthew Harrington by the creek that separated their properties. They'd talked about books, about the changing territory since Arizona had become a state in 1912, about dreams bigger than the dusty cattle ranches they'd both inherited portions of. There had been nothing improper about their conversation, yet Jacob had seen them from a distance and jumped to wild conclusions. The sound of horses approaching pulled Ruby from her thoughts. Jacob wouldn't be back so soon. He'd ridden into town for supplies and wouldn't return until morning, which was precisely why he'd locked her up. She strained to listen, heart pounding as boot steps approached the barn. The door creaked open, revealing a tall silhouette backlit by the setting sun. Ruby squinted, unable to make out the face. "Miss Wilson?" The voice was deep, unfamiliar. "Who's there?" Ruby called, trying to sound braver than she felt. The figure stepped inside, and as her eyes adjusted, she saw a man she'd never met before, tall and broad-shouldered, with a dark Stetson pulled low over his face. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, not the flashy gear of the outlaws who occasionally passed through the territory. "Name's Marshall Reynolds," he said, approaching cautiously. "I work for the Harrington Ranch. Matthew sent me to check on you after he heard your brother making threats in town." Ruby's breath caught. "My brother chained me up to keep me from seeing Matthew again." Marshall surveyed the chains, his jaw tightening. "That ain't right. No man should treat a lady this way, especially his own kin." He knelt beside her, examining the padlock. "I can get these off you, but then what? Your brother comes back, finds you gone." "I don't care," Ruby said firmly. "I can't stay here anymore, not with him acting this way." Marshall nodded slowly, then reached into his boot and pulled out a small metal tool. "Used to be a locksmith back in Texas before I took to ranching," he explained, working the tool into the padlock. "Comes in handy more often than you'd think." Ruby watched his hands, strong but surprisingly dexterous, as he manipulated the lock. "Why would Matthew send you instead of coming himself?" "Your brother's got a lot of friends in town," Marshall said, concentration evident in his voice. Matthew figured sending someone new, someone Jacob wouldn't recognize, would be safer for everyone. The lock clicked open, and he gently removed the chains from her wrists. "There we go." Ruby rubbed her raw skin, relief flooding through her. "Thank you." Marshall stood, offering his hand to help her up. "Miss Wilson, I don't mean to rush you, but we should get moving before anyone comes back." Ruby hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. His palm was calloused but warm, his grip steady as he helped her to her feet. For the first time, she got a clear look at his face, strong features, kind eyes that crinkled slightly at the corners, and a day's worth of stubble along his jaw. He was older than her, perhaps 28 or 30, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years under the western sun. "I need to grab some things from the house," Ruby said. Marshall nodded. "I'll come with you. Best be quick about it." They moved silently across the yard to the modest ranch house. Inside, Ruby hastily gathered clothes, a photograph of her parents, and the small amount of money she'd saved, wrapping everything in a blanket. Marshall stood guard by the window, watching for any sign of Jacob's return. "Ready?" he asked when she emerged from her room. "As I'll ever be," Ruby replied, trying to ignore the tightness in her chest. She was leaving the only home she'd ever known. Outside, Marshall led her to where two horses waited. "Can you ride astride?" he asked, eyeing her skirt. Ruby nodded. "Been riding since I could walk." He helped her mount, then swung up onto his own horse. "We'll head to the Harrington place first. Matthew's expecting us." They rode in silence through the gathering darkness, following a route that avoided the main road. Ruby's mind raced with questions, fears, and second thoughts. Was she making a terrible mistake? What would happen when Jacob discovered she was gone? As if sensing her turmoil, Marshall spoke. "Your brother, has he always been this way?" Ruby shook her head. "No, he was always protective but kind. After our father died this winter, something changed. He started seeing threats everywhere, especially from the Harringtons. Our families have had disagreements over water rights for years, but Jacob's turned it into something ugly." Marshall nodded thoughtfully. "Loss can change a man. I've seen it before." "Did Matthew tell you why my brother's so angry with him specifically?" Marshall hesitated. "He mentioned something about your father's will and property lines, said there was a misunderstanding." Ruby sighed. "That's putting it mildly. Our father's will specified that the eastern pasture, the one with the best access to the creek, would come to me when I turned 25 or if I married. Jacob thinks Matthew is courting me just to get control of that land." "And is he?" Marshall asked, his voice carefully neutral. Ruby looked at him sharply. "No, Matthew and I are friends. We grew up together, went to the same schoolhouse. If Jacob hadn't started this feud, we'd still just be neighbors." They rode on in silence for a while, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the nighttime chorus of desert creatures. The moon rose, casting long shadows across the scrubby landscape. "You said you were from Texas," Ruby said eventually. "What brought you to Arizona?" Marshall's expression shifted slightly. "Looking for something new, I suppose. Texas got complicated." "Complicated how?" He smiled faintly. "You ask a lot of questions, Miss Wilson." "Ruby," she corrected him. "And yes, I do. My father always said curiosity was my best and worst quality." "Fair enough, Ruby." Marshall adjusted his hat. "I left Texas because I found myself on the wrong side of a powerful man's anger. Nothing criminal, mind you, just a disagreement that got out of hand. Over a woman," Ruby guessed. Marshall laughed softly. "No, over horses. I called him out for mistreating his animals. He didn't take kindly to it." Ruby studied him in the moonlight, trying to reconcile this glimpse of his character with the stranger who'd appeared to rescue her. There was something about him that inspired trust, despite the circumstances. After riding for nearly an hour, they approached the Harrington ranch. Unlike the Wilson property, which had fallen into disrepair since her father's illness, the Harrington place was well maintained, with a large main house and several outbuildings. Matthew Harrington was waiting on the porch when they arrived, his face lighting up when he saw Ruby. He hurried down the steps to help her dismount. "Thank God you're all right," he said, taking her hands in his. "When I overheard Jacob in the saloon talking about teaching you a lesson." He shook his head. "I couldn't believe it. He chained me up in the barn," Ruby said, her voice breaking slightly, "if Marshall hadn't come when he did." Matthew turned to Marshall, who was dismounting his own horse. "I can't thank you enough," Marshall nodded, "just doing what needed doing." Ruby noticed an odd tension between the two men, but attributed it to the stressful situation. Matthew led them inside, where his parents were waiting. George and Alina Harrington had always been kind to Ruby, even as the relationship between the families deteriorated. Alina immediately wrapped Ruby in a motherly embrace. "You poor dear," she said. "You'll stay with us as long as you need to." "Thank you," Ruby said, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the day. "I don't know what to do. Jacob will be furious when he finds I'm gone." George Harrington, a tall man with graying hair and Matthew's same blue eyes, spoke up. Let me worry about Jacob. This feud has gone on long enough, and what he did today crosses a line no man should cross. Pa, Matthew interjected, Jacob's not thinking straight. Ever since Mr. Wilson died, that's no excuse for putting his sister in chains, George said firmly. We'll deal with this properly through the law if necessary. Alina guided Ruby to a chair. You must be exhausted. Let me fix you something to eat and then you can rest. As Alina bustled about preparing food, Ruby became aware of Marshall standing quietly by the door as if unsure of his place. She caught his eye and gave him a grateful smile. Will you stay too? She asked. Before Marshall could answer, Matthew spoke. Of course he will. It's too late to ride back to the bunkhouse now. He turned to Marshall. You can take the room at the end of the hall upstairs. Marshall nodded. Much obliged. Over a simple meal of beans, bread, and coffee, they discussed what to do next. George was adamant about involving Sheriff Taylor, while Matthew argued for a more private resolution. Ruby sat quietly, her eyes occasionally drifting to Marshall, who seemed to be observing everything with careful attention. What do you think, Mr. Reynolds? Alina asked, noticing his silence. Marshall considered before answering. In my experience, family disputes rarely benefit from outside interference, but what happened today wasn't just a dispute, it was unlawful imprisonment. Miss Wilson has every right to press charges. I don't want Jacob arrested, Ruby said quickly. He's still my brother, he's just not himself lately. Then what do you want? Marshall asked, his direct gaze making Ruby's heart beat a little faster. I want my freedom, she replied. The freedom to make my own choices, to live my own life, whether that means staying here, going to town, or, she hesitated, or seeing whoever I choose to see. Matthew reached over and squeezed her hand. And you should have that freedom. Marshall's eyes flickered to their joined hands, then back to his plate. After dinner, Alina showed Ruby to a guest room. The comfort of a real bed after her ordeal was overwhelming, and despite her racing thoughts, she quickly fell into an exhausted sleep. She woke to shouting. Disoriented, Ruby sat up in the unfamiliar bed as the events of the previous day came rushing back. Sunlight streamed through the window, indicating it was well into morning. The shouting continued from outside, and she recognized one of the voices immediately. Jacob. Ruby rushed to the window. In the yard below, Jacob faced off against George and Matthew Harrington. Several ranch hands, including Marshall, stood nearby, tension evident in their postures. You've got no right to keep my sister here, Jacob was yelling, his hand hovering near the pistol at his hip. She came of her own free will after you chained her up like an animal, George replied, his voice calm but firm. What kind of man does that to his own sister? I was protecting her from your scheming son, Jacob pointed accusingly at Matthew. Everyone knows he's just after her land. Ruby didn't wait to hear more. She dressed quickly and hurried downstairs and out onto the porch. All eyes turned to her as she appeared. Ruby, get your things. We're leaving, Jacob commanded. I'm not going anywhere with you, Ruby said, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. She walked down the steps to stand beside Matthew, deliberately placing herself between the feuding parties. Jacob's face darkened with rage. You've turned my own sister against me, he said to Matthew. I won't forget this. This isn't about the Harringtons, Jacob, Ruby said. It's about what you did. You locked me up. How could you? I was protecting you. From what? From having friends, from making my own decisions. Ruby shook her head in disgust. That's not protection, Jacob. That's control. Jacob's eyes narrowed. So that's how it is. You're choosing them over your own blood. I'm choosing myself, Ruby replied. When you're ready to treat me like an adult instead of property, we can talk. For a moment, Jacob seemed at a loss for words, then his gaze hardened. Fine, but don't think you're welcome back at our father's house. And don't think I'll forget this betrayal. He turned to Marshall, who had moved closer during the confrontation. And you, whoever you are, keep out of Wilson family business if you know what's good for you. Marshall met his gaze steadily but said nothing. With a final glare at the assembled group, Jacob mounted his horse and rode away, dust billowing behind him. The tension in the yard dissipated slowly. George placed a hand on Ruby's shoulder. You handled that well, young lady. Ruby wasn't so sure. The confrontation had left her shaken, torn between relief at standing up to her brother and grief at the widening rift between them. "He'll come around," Alina said kindly, joining them. "He just needs time." Matthew took Ruby's hand. "In the meantime, you're welcome here for as long as you need." Ruby smiled weakly, but as she thanked the Harringtons, she found herself looking for Marshall. He stood apart from the others, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. When their eyes met, he gave her a slight nod before turning away to tend to the horses. Over the next several days, Ruby settled into life at the Harrington ranch. Alina treated her like a daughter, teaching her to make preserves and showing her how to manage the household accounts. George included her in discussions about the ranch, respecting her opinions and knowledge of cattle raising. And Matthew was a constant, attentive presence, taking her riding, reading to her in the evenings, clearly hoping their friendship might blossom into something more. But it was Marshall who increasingly occupied her thoughts. Unlike the others, he maintained a respectful distance, busy with his duties around the ranch. Yet Ruby often caught him watching her, and when their paths did cross, their conversations, though brief, left her feeling strangely exhilarated. One afternoon, about a week after her arrival, Ruby was helping Alina in the garden when Marshall approached, leading a chestnut mare. "Mrs. Harrington, Mr. George asked me to check the north fence line today. Thought I might take Miss Wilson along if she's interested. Get her mind off things." Alina looked between them, a knowing smile playing at her lips. "I think that's a fine idea. Ruby's been cooped up too long." Ruby dusted the soil from her hands. "I'd like that very much." Within half an hour, they were riding across the Harrington property, the vast Arizona landscape spreading out before them. The spring air was cool but pleasant, filled with the scent of sage and wildflowers. "You ride well," Marshall observed as Ruby easily kept pace with him. "My father taught me," she replied. "He said a woman on a ranch needs to ride as well as any man, wise man." They rode in companionable silence for a while before Ruby spoke again. "I've been meaning to thank you properly." "For what you did that night," Marshall shrugged. "Anyone would have done the same." "No, they wouldn't," Ruby insisted. "Most men would have minded their own business. You risked a lot for someone you'd never met." Marshall was quiet for a moment. "I believe people should be free to make their own choices. Your brother took that from you. It wasn't right." "Is that why you left Texas? Because someone took your choices away?" He looked at her in surprise. "You remember that?" "I remember everything you've told me," Ruby said, then blushed at how forward that sounded. Marshall smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his serious face. "Yes, I suppose that was part of it. The man I mentioned, he was powerful enough to make sure I couldn't work with horses anywhere in the county. Said he'd ruin me if I stayed. So you came here." "So I came here," he agreed. "Started fresh." Ruby considered this. "Do you miss it? Texas? Sometimes, but Arizona's growing on me." His eyes met hers briefly before looking away. They reached the north fence line, where Marshall dismounted to check the posts and wire. Ruby watched him work, admiring the efficient way he moved, the strength in his hands as he repaired a loose section. "How long have you worked for the Harringtons?" she asked. "About 4 months," he replied, hammering a post more securely into place, and before that, he glanced up at her. "Still asking lots of questions, I see," Ruby smiled, still curious. Marshall straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow. "I worked at a few ranches between Texas and here, never stayed too long in one place. And will you stay here at the Harrington Ranch?" Something flickered in his eyes, hesitation, perhaps, or uncertainty. "That depends." "On what?" Before he could answer, the sound of an approaching rider drew their attention. Matthew appeared, riding hard toward them. "There you are," he called as he neared. "Ma said you'd gone out this way." Ruby noticed how Marshall immediately stepped back, his expression becoming neutral, professional. "We were checking the fence line, sir," he said. Matthew barely acknowledged him, his attention fixed on Ruby. "I've been looking all over for you. Sheriff Taylor just rode out to the house. He has news about your brother." Ruby's stomach clenched with anxiety. "What kind of news?" "Seems Jacob's been in town, drinking heavily and making threats. The sheriff's concerned he might do something foolish." "I should talk to him," Ruby said immediately. Matthew shook his head. It's too dangerous. The sheriff thinks Jacob's unhinged. He's talking about coming for you, about settling scores with us. All the more reason I should try to reason with him, Ruby insisted. He's my brother. Ruby, please. Matthew took her hands in his. Let's discuss this back at the house with Pa and the sheriff. Ruby looked to Marshall, whose face revealed nothing of his thoughts. What do you think? She asked him. Matthew answered before Marshall could speak. Reynolds, finish checking the fence. I'll escort Miss Wilson back to the house. Marshall nodded. Yes, sir. His eyes met Ruby's briefly. Be careful, Miss Wilson. The ride back to the ranch was tense, with Matthew repeatedly assuring Ruby that everything would be fine if she just let the men handle the situation. His words grated on her. They sounded too much like Jacob's controlling attitude, just wrapped in gentler packaging. At the house, Sheriff Taylor confirmed what Matthew had said. Jacob had been making increasingly erratic statements in town, fueled by whiskey and wounded pride. I'm concerned he might do something rash, the sheriff said. When a man feels he's lost everything, he can become desperate. He hasn't lost everything, Ruby objected. He has the ranch, the cattle, but not his sister, George Harrington interjected gently. And from what I understand, you two were close before your father passed. Ruby felt tears threatening. It was true. Despite their 7-year age gap, she and Jacob had always been close. Their mother had died when Ruby was just 4, leaving Jacob and their father to raise her. Jacob had taught her to ride, to shoot, to stand up for herself. When had that protective love twisted into possessiveness? What can I do? She asked the sheriff. For now, stay here where it's safe, Taylor advised. I've warned Jacob to keep his distance from the Harrington property. He didn't take it well, but he knows I'll lock him up if he causes trouble. After the sheriff left, Matthew suggested a ride into town the next day. It might do you good to get away from the ranch for a while, he said. We could have lunch at the hotel, maybe visit the new dry goods store, Ruby agreed, though her heart wasn't in it. She spent a restless night thinking about Jacob, alone and angry at their family home, and about Marshall, whose quiet strength had become a comfort she couldn't explain. The next morning, she dressed in one of the new skirts Alina had helped her alter and prepared for the trip to town. As she and Matthew were about to depart, Marshall approached, looking uncomfortable. Mr. Harrington, he addressed Matthew, your father asked me to ride along today. With Jacob Wilson making threats, he thought extra protection might be wise. Matthew frowned. We'll be fine, Reynolds. I'm armed. I'd feel better with Marshall along, Ruby said quickly. When Matthew looked at her in surprise, she added, if my brother really is as unstable as the sheriff says, one gun may not be enough. Matthew clearly wasn't pleased, but he nodded curtly. Fine, but stay back, Reynolds. I don't want people thinking we need a bodyguard. The ride to town was awkward, with Matthew chatting about ranch business while Marshall trailed several yards behind them. Ruby found herself repeatedly glancing back, wishing he could join their conversation. Mesa Creek was a small but growing town, with a main street that featured a hotel, saloon, general store, bank, and a handful of other businesses. As they rode in, Ruby was acutely aware of the stares from townspeople who clearly knew about the situation between the Wilson and Harrington families. They tied their horses outside the hotel, and Matthew offered Ruby his arm to escort her inside. Marshall remained with the horses, his eyes scanning the street vigilantly. Lunch was a stilted affair. Matthew seemed determined to pretend everything was normal, discussing plans for cattle sales and hinting at a future that increasingly included Ruby. For her part, Ruby found her attention wandering, her gaze often drifting to the window where she could see Marshall standing guard outside. After lunch, they visited the general store, where Matthew encouraged Ruby to select whatever she needed. Consider it a gift, he insisted when she protested. As Ruby examined a bolt of fabric, the store's bell jangled and a hush fell over the other customers. She turned to see Jacob standing in the doorway, his clothes rumpled and his eyes bloodshot. So it's true, he said, his voice slurring slightly. My sister parading around town with a Harrington. Matthew stepped protectively in front of Ruby. You're drunk, Wilson. Go home before you make a fool of yourself. Jacob ignored him, his gaze fixed on Ruby, Come home, sis. Whatever I did, I'm sorry, but don't do this, don't choose them over family. Ruby's heart ached at the genuine pain in his voice. Jacob, I haven't chosen anyone over you. You pushed me away when you tried to control me, when I what? Tried to protect you from fortune hunters. Jacob's gaze hardened as he looked at Matthew. Everyone knows the Harringtons have been after our water rights for years. Now they're using you to get them. Before Matthew could respond, Marshall appeared in the doorway behind Jacob. Mr. Wilson, he said quietly, this isn't the place for this conversation. Jacob whirled around. You, his hand moved toward his gun. You're the one who broke into my property, who stole my sister. Marshall remained calm, his hands visible and away from his own weapon. No one stole anyone. Your sister left of her own free will after you chained her up. Now I'm asking you politely to step outside and cool down. The store had emptied of other customers, the owner hovering nervously behind the counter. Matthew had positioned himself firmly between Ruby and Jacob, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. Jacob, please, Ruby implored. Let's talk about this rationally, not here, not like this. For a moment it seemed Jacob might listen, then his face contorted with rage. Rationally, while you run around with the man who's trying to steal our land, while this drifter interferes in our family business. He drew his gun, pointing it not at Matthew but at Marshall. This ends now. Everything happened at once. Ruby screamed a warning. Matthew lunged for Jacob's arm, and Marshall moved with surprising speed, knocking the gun upward as it discharged, the bullet splintering the ceiling. In the ensuing struggle, Marshall disarmed Jacob with practiced ease, twisting his arm behind his back and forcing him to his knees. Jacob fought wildly, cursing and threatening, until the sheriff burst through the door, drawn by the gunshot. What in blazes is going on here? Sheriff Taylor demanded. Wilson pulled a gun, Marshall explained, still restraining the struggling man. Fired a shot at the ceiling. The sheriff took in the scene the terrified store owner, Matthew, standing protectively near Ruby, Marshall restraining Jacob. Wilson, I warned you about causing trouble. He took out his handcuffs. You're spending some time in my jail to cool off. As the sheriff led Jacob away, Ruby caught her brother's devastated expression. Despite everything, she felt a stab of guilt and grief. This wasn't the brother she knew and loved. Are you all right? Matthew asked, putting an arm around her shoulders. Ruby nodded numbly, but her eyes were on Marshall, who was retrieving Jacob's fallen gun. You could have been killed, she said to him. Marshall shrugged. Wasn't the first time someone's pulled a gun on me, probably won't be the last. Thank you, she said softly. Again. Matthew tightened his arm around her. We should get back to the ranch. Pa needs to know what happened. The ride back was somber, with Ruby lost in thought about her brother's fate and the dangerous confrontation they'd barely escaped. This time, Marshall rode alongside them rather than behind, his presence a reassuring buffer against the tumult of her emotions. At the ranch, George Harrington was furious when he heard about Jacob's actions. That's it, he declared. I'm filing a formal complaint. The man's dangerous. He's hurting, Ruby protested. He needs help, not jail. He needs consequences, George countered. He could have killed someone today. The argument continued through dinner, with Matthew and his father united in their conviction that Jacob must face legal repercussions, while Ruby pleaded for understanding. Alina remained largely silent, occasionally patting Ruby's hand in sympathy. Marshall, who had been invited to join them for the meal given his role in the day's events, spoke up unexpectedly. If I may, he said, his quiet voice cutting through the heated discussion, I've seen situations like this before. Sometimes a man gets so fixated on what he thinks he's lost that he can't see what he's throwing away. Mr. Wilson seems to believe he's fighting for his family legacy, but in the process, he's destroying his relationship with his only family. The table fell silent as they considered his words. What would you suggest, Mr. Reynolds? Alina asked. Marshall looked at Ruby. I think Miss Wilson needs to speak with her brother, not in town with an audience, not with guns and threats, but privately, maybe with the sheriff present, but no Harringtons. He glanced apologetically at George. No offense intended, sir. And if he refuses to listen, Matthew challenged, if he tries to hurt her again, Then at least she'll know she tried, Marshall replied simply. And Mr. Wilson will have made his choice with a clear head, not clouded by whiskey and public humiliation. George Harrington studied Marshall thoughtfully. You know, Reynolds, you're an interesting man. Been meaning to ask where you learned to handle yourself like you did today. That wasn't cowboy training. Marshall met his employer's gaze steadily. I worked as a deputy marshal for a spell in Texas. Learned a few things about diffusing situations. This revelation surprised everyone at the table, especially Ruby. She realized how little she actually knew about the man who had twice come to her rescue. A lawman, George mused. That explains a lot. He turned to Ruby. I think Reynolds has a point. You should talk to your brother tomorrow when he's sober. I'll arrange it with Sheriff Taylor. The next morning, Ruby found herself sitting in Sheriff Taylor's office, waiting for Jacob to be brought from the cell in the back. Marshall had ridden into town with her, but at her request he waited outside, giving her privacy for the conversation. When Jacob entered, hands cuffed in front of him, Ruby was shocked by his appearance. He looked haggard, with several days' growth of beard and dark circles under his eyes. But he was sober, and his gaze was clearer than it had been in months. Ruby, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, I didn't think you'd come. You're my brother, Jacob, she replied simply. Of course I came. Sheriff Taylor removed the handcuffs. You've got 15 minutes, he said before stepping outside. For a moment the siblings stared at each other, the weight of recent events hanging between them. I'm sorry, Jacob finally said, his voice breaking. For all of it. For the chains, for the gun. I don't know what's happening to me, Ruby. Ruby felt tears well in her eyes. I'm sorry too. I should have seen how much you were hurting after Pa died. That's no excuse for what I did. Jacob ran a hand over his face. When Pa was dying, he made me promise to look after you, to protect you. But I took it too far. I got so focused on keeping the ranch together, on keeping you safe, that I stopped seeing you as your own person. The ranch is my heritage too, Ruby reminded him gently. And I'm a grown woman now. I need to make my own choices, my own mistakes. Even if that means choosing Matthew Harrington? Jacob asked, a hint of the old bitterness creeping into his voice. Ruby hesitated. Matthew has been kind to me, but I haven't chosen anyone, Jacob. I'm just trying to figure out who I am without Pa, without. She gestured vaguely, without the way things used to be. Jacob nodded slowly. The sheriff says I'm facing charges for discharging a firearm in town, for threatening that cowboy. He looked up at her. Is he really just a cowboy? He moved like a gunslinger. He used to be a deputy marshal in Texas, Ruby admitted. His name is Marshall Reynolds. A flicker of respect crossed Jacob's face. He could have shot me, would have been justified. Instead, he just disarmed me like I was a child having a tantrum. He believes in second chances, Ruby said. So do I. Jacob reached across the table, tentatively taking her hand. I don't deserve one, but I'm asking anyway. Give me a chance to make this right, Ruby. I'll get help for the drinking. I'll respect your choices, even if I don't always agree with them. Ruby squeezed his hand. That's all I ever wanted, Jacob, just respect, not control. When Sheriff Taylor returned, Ruby asked about the charges Jacob was facing. Public intoxication, disturbing the peace, brandishing a weapon, Taylor listed. Could mean jail time. Is there any way to resolve this without jail? Ruby asked. My brother's not himself since our father died. He needs help, not punishment, the sheriff considered. Well, if the Harringtons don't press charges for the threat, and if your brother agrees to certain conditions, staying sober, keeping his distance from town for a while, maybe some community service, I might be able to work something out. Jacob nodded eagerly. Anything, I'll do anything. Outside, Ruby found Marshall waiting patiently, leaning against a hitching post. His face brightened when he saw her, though he quickly masked his reaction. How did it go? He asked. Ruby felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Better than I expected. Jacobs agreed to get help. The sheriff might let him go if the Harringtons don't press charges. Marshall straightened. That's good news. Do you want to speak with them now? Please, Ruby said. Will you come with me? The conversation with George Harrington was tense but productive. While initially resistant, he eventually agreed not to press charges on the condition that Jacob stay away from his property and family. And that includes you if you choose to stay with us, George told Ruby. I won't have him harassing you, Ruby shook her head. Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Harrington, but I think it's time I went home. Jacob needs me, and I need to be on Wilson land, working our ranch. Her announcement clearly disappointed Matthew, who had assumed she would continue living at their home. But Ruby, after everything that's happened, I'll be fine, she assured him. Jacob's agreed to respect my independence, and I need to give him a chance to prove he means it. Matthew took her hands in his. At least let me continue to call on you. We've grown closer these past weeks. Ruby gently extracted her hands. Matthew, you've been a good friend, but I'm not ready for more than that. I need time to sort out my own life before I can think about sharing it with someone else. Later, as Ruby prepared to return to the Wilson ranch, Marshall offered to help her move her belongings. They rode side by side, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the trail. You're sure about this? Marshall asked. Going back to your brother's house, Ruby nodded. It's my house too. And Jacob won't be the same as before. He's had a wake-up call. People don't change overnight, Marshall cautioned. I know, but they do change. She glanced at him. You did, after leaving Texas, became someone new, Marshall smiled faintly. Not new. Just more myself without the constraints others put on me. They rode in companionable silence for a while before Ruby spoke again. Will you still be working for the Harringtons? For a time, Marshall replied, but I've been thinking of moving on. Ruby felt an unexpected pang at his words. Where would you go? He shrugged. There's talk of a ranch for sale up north, smaller than the Harrington place, but good land. I've been saving to buy my own spread someday. You'd be a rancher, not a hired hand. That's the dream. Marshall looked at her curiously. Why do you ask? Ruby felt her cheeks warm. I'd hate to think you were leaving because of what happened, because of me. Marshall reined his horse to a stop, prompting Ruby to do the same. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. Ruby, meeting you has been the best thing that's happened to me in a long while. I'm not leaving because of you, if anything. He hesitated. If anything, you're the only reason I'd consider staying. Ruby's heart fluttered at his words and the intensity in his eyes. Marshall, he held up a hand. You don't need to say anything. You're right to focus on healing your family right now. I just wanted you to know. They continued to the Wilson ranch in silence, both aware that something significant had shifted between them. Jacob was already home when they arrived, having been released by the sheriff with strict conditions. His surprise at seeing Ruby return quickly gave way to gratitude, especially when she made it clear that she was moving back permanently. The east bedroom is yours, he said immediately. I've moved my things to Pa's old room, and Ruby, he added earnestly, you come and go as you please, no questions asked, I promise. Marshall helped carry Ruby's things inside, nodding politely to Jacob but maintaining a wary distance. When it was time for him to leave, Ruby walked him to his horse. Thank you, she said, for everything, for the rescue, for the advice about Jacob, she gestured vaguely, for understanding. Marshall mounted his horse, looking down at her with a smile that made her pulse quicken. I'm just up the road if you need anything at all. As the weeks passed, Ruby settled back into life on the Wilson ranch. True to his word, Jacob respected her independence, even when she began making changes to how they ran the cattle operation. He attended meetings with a temperance group in town and slowly began to rebuild his reputation among their neighbors. Ruby occasionally saw Matthew Harrington at church or in town, and while he remained friendly, he seemed to have accepted her decision not to pursue a courtship. She was grateful for his understanding and the continued goodwill between their families, but it was Marshall who increasingly occupied her thoughts. He would appear sometimes when she was in town, tipping his hat and asking after her well-being. Once, when a sudden storm caught her on the road home, he materialized as if by magic to offer his slicker and escort her safely back to the Wilson ranch. Each encounter left her more certain of her growing feelings for him, though neither of them spoke of that day's conversation. Then, in early summer, Ruby learned from Alina Harrington that Marshall had given notice. The ranch up north had come up for sale, and he'd made an offer. He'd be leaving within the month. The news hit Ruby harder than she expected. She'd assumed there would be more time, that somehow they'd find their way to each other naturally. Now he was leaving, and she hadn't told him how she felt. After a sleepless night, Ruby rode to the Harrington ranch early the next morning. She found Marshall in the corral working with a young horse. He looked up in surprise as she approached. "Ruby, is everything all right? Mrs. Harrington tells me you're leaving," she said without preamble. Marshall nodded, running a hand along the horse's neck. "Got word yesterday. My offer on the Freeman place was accepted. When were you going to tell me?" He looked uncomfortable. "I was going to ride over this evening. Didn't want to say anything until it was certain." Ruby crossed her arms. "And what am I supposed to do when you're gone?" "Who's going to rescue me the next time I'm in trouble?" A smile tugged at Marshall's lips. "From what I've seen lately, you're doing just fine rescuing yourself." "That's not the point," Ruby said, frustrated by his calm demeanor. "You can't just ride into someone's life, change everything, make them feel things they've never felt before, and then ride away again." Marshall's expression softened. He secured the horse to the fence post and walked toward Ruby, stopping just a few feet away. "What things would those be, Miss Wilson?" Ruby felt her face flush. "You know very well what I mean." "I think I might," he said quietly, "but I'd like to hear you say it." Ruby took a deep breath. "I've developed feelings for you, Marshall, strong feelings. And the thought of you leaving, of never knowing what might have been between us, it hurts." Marshall took a step closer. "Ruby, I've been halfway in love with you since the night I broke those chains off your wrists, but your life was complicated. You needed time with your brother, time to heal your family. And now," Ruby asked, her heart racing, "now I'm buying a ranch that needs a lot of work, that will take everything I have to make successful." He reached out, tentatively taking her hands in his. "It's not much to offer a woman like you." Ruby squeezed his hands. "I don't need much, just honesty, respect, and—" She looked up at him, "and love." Marshall's smile was brilliant. "Those I can promise." He hesitated. "But what about your brother, your ranch? Jacob and I have talked. He knows how I feel about you. He's not entirely comfortable with it, but he respects my choice." Ruby smiled. "As for the ranch, we've worked out an arrangement. He'll buy my share over time, except for the east pasture, which is mine outright. I can do with it what I please." Marshall's eyes widened in understanding. "The pasture that borders the Freeman property," Ruby nodded. "It seems we might be neighbors, Mr. Reynolds." "Neighbors," Marshall repeated, his voice husky. "Is that all you're hoping for?" Ruby stepped closer, emboldened by the look in his eyes. "To start with, but I'm open to negotiation." Marshall laughed softly, then grew serious. "Ruby Wilson, from the moment I saw you in chains, I knew you were a woman worth fighting for, but I never imagined you might fight for me too." "Get used to it," Ruby whispered. "I know what I want now." When Marshall finally kissed her, it felt like the culmination of everything they'd been through: the danger, the uncertainty, the gradual building of trust and affection. His lips were gentle at first, then more insistent as Ruby responded with equal fervor. They were married that autumn, in a small ceremony attended by both the Wilsons and the Harringtons. Jacob, sober and genuinely trying to make amends, gave his sister away with a smile that, if not entirely happy, was at least accepting. The Freeman Ranch, combined with Ruby's pasture-land, became the Reynolds Ranch, a modest but promising spread that grew steadily over the years. Marshall's experience with horses proved valuable, and under their joint management, they developed a reputation for breeding some of the finest stock in the territory. On their first anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their newly built home watching the sunset, Marshall presented Ruby with a small wooden box. "What's this?" she asked, opening it to find a delicate silver bracelet. Marshall took it from the box and fastened it around her wrist. "A reminder," he said, "of chains broken and freedom found." Ruby touched the bracelet, tears pricking her eyes. "I never thought I'd be thankful for my brother's misguided attempt to control me, but if he hadn't locked me up that night." "We might never have met," Marshall finished, drawing her close. "Some chains lead to freedom, it seems. And some strangers become home," Ruby replied, leaning into his embrace as the Arizona sky blazed with color, painting the promise of their future across the wide, open land they now shared. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys to the Reynolds ranch. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, market fluctuations, and the changing landscape of Arizona as it grew and developed. Their herd expanded, their reputation for quality horses spread, and their modest home was enlarged to accommodate their growing family. Their first child, a daughter named Eleanor after Mrs. Harrington, arrived just before their second anniversary. She was followed 2 years later by a son they named Thomas, after Marshall's father. Both children grew up strong and capable, learning to ride almost as soon as they could walk, inheriting their mother's determination and their father's steady calm. Jacob Wilson remained a complex presence in their lives. He stayed true to his promise to remain sober and gradually rebuilt the Wilson Ranch to its former prosperity. His relationship with Ruby healed over time, and though he and Marshall maintained a cautious respect rather than true friendship, they worked together when necessary and presented a united front during difficult times. On the 10th anniversary of the day Marshall broke Ruby's chains, they hosted a gathering that brought together the Wilsons, the Harringtons, and the many friends they'd made over the years. As twilight fell and lanterns were lit around the yard, Marshall found Ruby standing alone, watching their children play with the other youngsters. "Happy?" he asked, slipping an arm around her waist. Ruby leaned into him, her hand automatically finding the silver bracelet she still wore. "More than I ever imagined possible." Marshall kissed her temple. "No regrets about choosing a former deputy marshal turned rancher over a Harrington?" Ruby laughed. "Not a single one." She turned in his arms, studying the face she'd grown to love even more deeply over the years. The lines around his eyes had deepened, and streaks of silver now threaded through his hair. But his gaze still held the same steadfast devotion she'd first recognized that night in her brother's barn. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when Jacob locked me up, I was furious, terrified, but mostly I felt trapped not just by the chains, but by a future where I'd never have choices of my own." Marshall nodded, waiting for her to continue. "Then you appeared, a stranger who respected my right to decide my own fate, even when you hardly knew me." Ruby reached up to touch his cheek. "You didn't just break my chains, Marshall. You showed me I was strong enough to break them myself." "You always were," he said simply. "I just handed you the tools." As the celebration continued around them, Ruby reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from captivity to freedom, from stranger to beloved, from isolation to community. The chains that had once bound her wrists had, in their breaking, forged an unexpected path to a life richer and more fulfilling than she could have imagined. And as Marshall pulled her closer for a kiss that still made her heart race after all these years, Ruby knew with absolute certainty that sometimes the greatest freedom comes not from the absence of bonds, but from choosing the right ones.